I will just make some opening remarks so long, and hopefully people will trickle in a bit more. So greetings to everyone joining us today, and a good morning to Professor Paul Kahn joining us from New Haven, Connecticut, and a good evening to Dr. Deval Desai joining us from Edinburgh in Scotland. And I thank you to the both of them for taking the time to join us today to discuss their work. Welcome everyone. Many of you are joining us from Johannesburg and the rest of the country and the rest of the continent. So good evening. This is the first engagement for the year under the auspices of the Quality of Democracy Research Committee within the South African Association of Political Studies. And it's co-organized with our partner, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study here at the University of Johannesburg. So our book today is called Democracy in Times of Pandemic, Different Futures Imagined. And as a University of Johannesburg person, I always make a mental typo of saying, when I read the subtitle of saying different futures reimagined, because the future reimagined happens to be our slogan here at the University of Johannesburg. Now the book is co-edited by Professor Miguel Maduro and by Professor Paul Kahn, who's joining us today. And in the book, Paul has an essay, as does Deval and his colleagues Shalini, Randeria, and Christine Lutringer, chapters 13 and 14 in the volume. The book was an obvious choice for us because it talks about a very fundamental concept and a very central ideal to our research committee, that is democracy. And it speaks about democracy in a very contemporary sense and in a very future-oriented sense, due to the nature of the pandemic, which has swept the globe and affected institutions the world over, offering, as the authors rightly put, each in their own way, how this has created laboratory-like conditions through which to understand the exercise or application of power, how governments acquire and operationalize knowledge almost in real time, as well as the entitlements and obligations that come with citizenship. So we're going to proceed as follows this evening. We'll first have the two guests, the two contributors present on their chapters for about 15 to 20 minutes each. I will then offer a brief commentary, promise I won't be too long, based on my reading of the book and their chapters particularly. And then we will have an audience-driven discussion in response to their lectures. And we do look forward to your questions this evening. So please make use of the chat box along the way, but also you will have the liberty to activate your microphone once we are in the audience participation portion. So allow me now to please introduce Paul. Professor Paul Kahn is the Robert W. Wiener Professor of Law and the Humanities, as well as the director of the Orville H. Schell, a Junior Center for International Human Rights at Yale, at the Yale Law School. His areas of teaching include pretty much everything under the sun: constitutional law and theory, international law, cultural theory, and philosophy. He clerked for a very respected justice in the United States Supreme Court, Justice Byron White, as well as practiced law in Washington, D.C., during which time he was on the legal team representing the country of Nicaragua before the International Court of Justice. He's an author and editor of many, many books. I stopped counting somewhere around 15. And he says his trick is writing 3 pages a day. Some of his books include Legitimacy and History, Self-Government in American Constitutional Theory, The Cultural Study of Law, Putting Liberalism in Its Place, Sacred Violence, Torture, Terror, and Sovereignty. And for our purposes today, also Democracy in Times of Pandemic. Paul earned his bachelor from the University of Chicago and his PhD in philosophy from Yale, as well as his Juris Doctor from Yale. So Paul, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Can you hear me all right? Is everything fine?
Absolutely, we can.
This is my first appearance in South Africa. I hadn't imagined it would quite be in this form, but I'm happy to be here in a spirit, electronically, I guess, if not in body. So let me say a word about the project. This paper, which became the chapter, which is the last chapter in the book, actually was the first chapter in the idea of the book. I had this project, as Bhaso said, of writing. I like to write every day. When the pandemic started, I was going to write an essay every day, I decided, under these unusual conditions. Philosopher faces the pandemic. And every once in a while, I wrote one that I kind of liked. And so I started writing about this idea of sacrifice, which is at the core of this paper. And I thought, well, this should be developed. About the same time that I wrote that, my good friend Miguel Maduro from Portugal called and said he had this idea of putting together a book of essays on democracy in times of pandemic. Would I like to co-edit with him? And I said, well, I need a site to publish this essay, so let's do this. And out of that came this book, which was produced extraordinarily quickly. Nobody thought we could do this. We contacted what we thought were leading scholars, some of whom we knew pretty well, around the world, and gave them 3 weeks to write an original essay. That was it, 3 weeks, and they all produced. So the book was produced in remarkable time and tried to make a real-time contribution. So I'm going to give you a shortened version of this essay. I assume most of you have not read it, and it's kind of my take on what was going on and how to think about it. And then I look forward to your questions. So the essay is called Democracy and the Obligations of Care. A pandemic arises when biology meets politics. The biology is universal, but politics are local. Every nation accordingly has its own pandemic. Even nations at the same level of economic development have had very different pandemics. The UK's pandemic is not that of Italy. That of the United States is not that of Japan. And India's pandemic is its alone. The threat of the virus to a community accordingly raises a political question as much as it raises questions for medical experts. The political face of the pandemic asks all of us, individually and collectively, what are we prepared to do? In these remarks, I want to consider how our democratic commitments bear on the response to that question. And for the political philosopher, the pandemic is something of a field day, raising questions of liberty, individual rights, social obligation, and legal compulsion. Thus my project to write a paper every day. How much protection is owed, at what cost, and to whom? Consider today's vaccine resistors, of whom we have quite a few in the United States. They may imperil others, but are they claiming a right that we should respect? The exercise of rights often poses risk to others. Decisions must be made even as citizens remain uncertain and divided. People vary in their willingness to assume risks to their health. They vary in their economic circumstances and in their eagerness to return to work. They do not all have access to the same facts, or they may reject facts. They may not understand the risks their behavior imposes on others. Economists and epidemiologists can help clarify facts, but they cannot make the political decisions. In the United States, we have repeatedly seen public health experts advising one thing and public officials doing another. Different individuals in private and public assess the costs and benefits differently, which is to say there is no right answer independent of politics. The pandemic is like a war, focusing the entire society on the obligations of citizenship and the responsibilities of political leadership. And you'll see if you look at the book, many of the essays take up these questions of political leadership and the obligations of citizenship. One of the surprises in the United States was the way in which the pandemic drew people into the political process rather than alienating them from it. We saw this first with the massive public demonstrations for the Black Lives Matter movement last spring, a year ago spring, and then in the increased voting rates in November, largest ever. Quantitatively, at least, the pandemic has been good for democratic participation. In multiple ways, people have been talking, listening, and trying to decide. They have confronted a variety of claims and justifications. American politics is one iteration of the experience of the political in modern democracies. All democratic nations have faced similar claims, which range from law to morality to what I call the sacrificial. And those are the topics I want to consider briefly. So first, let's think about legal rights as a limit on political decision-making. Pandemic decision-making inevitably confronts claims of legal right. Today, some are claiming a legal right to reject vaccination. Earlier, those pushing for a rapid end to the lockdown claimed a right to be free to carry out their ordinary activities. A judge on the Supreme Court of the state of Wisconsin, not the national Supreme Court, the state one, succinctly expressed this position. To be prohibited from leaving your home, he said, is the very definition of tyranny. That court struck down the governor's lockdown order. In the eyes of libertarians, the public health orders amount to home arrest without trial or convictions. Individuals, they claim, should be free to decide for themselves whether to accept the risks associated with a particular activity. For example, wearing a face mask or attending entertainment venues, or today, vaccination. These libertarian arguments gather support when they touch on religious freedom, particularly church services. And we've had a number of cases about this now. The American constitutional order grants a privileged place to religious claims of right, as if we measure the success of the political order by the protection it provides religious practices, regardless of the damage the protection may do to other values, including the public health. To be sure, this claim of right has little support in political theory. The libertarian strand in Western political thought has generally been kept within the bounds of John Stuart Mill's harm principle. Claims of individual right yield at the point at which one person's choices inflict injury on another. Government's role is to adjudicate claims at this border between rights and injuries. Arguably, when each of us is a potential biohazard to others, we are never free of the harm principle. To be sure, failure to satisfy Mill's harm principle does not defeat a claim of legal right in and of itself. A constitution or laws may be more protective of certain kinds of claims than political theory can support. Every legal system makes choices about what sorts of harms to recognize. America was born in the search for religious liberty. Perhaps that should matter, politically and legally. History matters in that other uniquely American claim of legal right, a right to gun ownership. Here too, Americans are very familiar with the limits of the harm principle in the face of a culturally grounded claim of legal right. There's long been a public health argument against gun ownership. Purchase a handgun to protect your home, and the risk of gun violence to your family members goes up dramatically for your purchaser as well. The exercise of your right causes injury to the innocent. These substantial and undeniable costs are excluded from consideration by our constitutional jurisprudence. That's what it means to have a legal right. The same preference for rights over injuries is found in our bedrock constitutional principle of free speech. My right to speak of public issues is not limited by the offense my speech may cause you. It's the right not to be treated tyrannically like this. This is communicating the virus to another a legally cognizable harm or merely a cost of living in a free society. We've learned in the last year that framing a claim as a legal right does not help us to settle our political disputes. Instead of law governing politics, the courts have themselves become sites of political contestation. Our prior president, Trump, spoke openly of what he called Trump judges. He was not alone in his belief that law is subordinate to partisan politics. Nevertheless, our last election also taught us that there are limits to what judges will do for the sake of political ends. Remember, Trump lost something like 60 cases in court. Even the so-called Trump judges, for the most part, resisted his efforts to undermine the elections through legal claims. And the courts have a mixed record now in responding to claims of legal right against lockdown measures. So let's move from law, formal law, to justice. If claims of legal right fail to resolve conflict, we are left with the ordinary mechanisms of representative politics. Democratic politics may be ruled by majorities, but it's not ruled by a mob. Electoral success is not a warrant to do anything that law permits. There is justice beyond law. At its best, political debate moves through contesting claims of the requirements of justice. Winning an election does not, for example, give the rich permission to treat the poor as a means, or to impose upon them life-threatening choices that the better off can ignore. Even with an electoral warrant, such decisions violate our justified political expectations. Issues of distributional justice have continually surfaced in the pandemic. Consider the treatment of essential workers, or differences in vaccination rates between communities. The pandemic is laying bare many of the structural injustices that remain in and between our communities. There's obviously an international part of this that we can discuss later, but for the moment, I'm focused on our national divisions. In ordinary circumstances, these injustices remain largely invisible. We call that structural injustice here. Today, they're difficult to ignore, which explains in part the explosion of concern in the Black Lives Matter movement. Of course, democratic politics is characterized by disagreement with respect to the principles of justice. We cannot ask that political leaders act on our idea of justice, but we can rightly expect them to act on an idea of justice. We can ask them to defend that idea against competing conceptions. Some argued, for example, that it is unjust to keep individuals from their jobs or to force businesses to close down when they have done nothing wrong. Let them defend that conception against those who argue that it's unjust to put the burden of making unsafe choices upon the less well-off. America today is in the middle of a vast debate about redistribution, driven by contesting claims of justice. These arguments over the demands of justice will neither begin nor end with polling data, or even with the results of an election. Principled disagreement raises our sense of the worth of our democracies, while competitive self-interest lowers it. Again, if you look in the volume, there's one or two essays about the ethos of self-interest. The responsibility of political leaders in a democracy is to take seriously their obligation to persuade for the right reasons. To persuade for the right reasons. That is, reasons that should be acceptable in principle by every citizen. Individuals will continue to differ in their ideas of justice. Democratic politics should force them to take their ideas seriously. And it can only do so when the voters take each other's ideas seriously. The pandemic has shown us over and over again that our politics can be no better than ourselves. Okay, now a third idea, legitimacy. Claims of legal right and claims of justice are two limits on democratic politics. Are there democratic obligations that extend beyond law and justice? To get to this, we have to consider the constitutive virtues of a political community. A political community is not a fact. It is a practice that we must uphold in our daily interactions. When we fail to care about each other, we have fallen back into the state of nature. Absent care, the community is grounded ultimately in fear and coercion. To consider obligations of care begin with the family. Members have obligations of justice to recognize each other's rights, but they also have obligations to care for each other. A failure of care can sever the ties of family just as much as a failure to respect rights can. A sick child deserves more than a sicker stranger. For the family has obligations of care toward the former, but not the latter. Rights recognition and care constitute two sides of a broad obligation of respect. To be treated justly, but as if a stranger, expresses a familial failure. This would be a family in name only, for it lacks love. Political communities, too, are grounded in acts of care for particular individuals. I owe the stranger justice, but not care. Conversely, I owe the members of my community care beyond justice. Obligations of right and obligations of care align with the distinction between justice, rights, and legitimacy, care. Justice operates in the first instance as a negative constraint on the state. Legitimacy speaks to the positive burden on the government to sustain citizen identification with the community as an ongoing historical enterprise. Questions of legitimacy ask how we stand with respect to a government choice, and through that choice, how we stand with respect to each other. A failure of care produces a distinct political pathology of alienation. Talk of the democracy deficit today, I'm thinking of the EU, for example, often points to the problem of alienation, not that of injustice. Care for and among citizens is related to, but not quite the same, as caring among members of a family. I care about my children as complete and full individuals, seeking to realize themselves in multiple dimensions. I do not care about other citizens in this way, even as I acknowledge that they make a distinct claim upon me. The politics of care cares for the social, public meanings that are at stake in political life. Conversely, a failure of care disregards those meanings. Of course, a careless government, for example, one that refuses to follow the science, and we have examples of these, fails, but a careless government fails, but care requires more than means and rationality, just as it requires more than justice. It requires recognition of the claim each of us makes to recognition and support. It requires an affirmation of the other as a source and a site of value that is constitutive of my own identity. Comprehensive justice can be a temptation for those who are inclined toward moral sainthood. Moral saints treat the stranger with the same concern as the family member. No one wants a moral saint for a parent, but do we want them for political leaders? There is something of the moral saint in the committed cosmopolitan. This is the moral matrix out of which arise contemporary disputes over vaccine distribution beyond the borders. Does an elected leader have an obligation of care to put his or her own citizens first? Might such a decision be both unjust and correct? In a democracy, we do not insist that representatives win every person's vote, but we do insist that they extend care to everyone. These obligations of care have frequently been at issue in the pandemic, from the way in which we reach out to minority or low-income communities to the way in which we balance teacher risk against family interests in setting school policies. The pandemic created a truly exceptional situation of a sort usually associated only with a war. It required a similar mobilization of national resources organized around a single mission of combating an existential threat. Healthcare workers risked their lives to combat the disease. Many died. Of course, people also die in wars. We give our elected officials the power to declare war. They're expected to make decisions in which they assess the threat to the public against the likely death and destruction of citizens. In making this decision, they must take care. What does it mean to take care in the exceptional situation? Many ordinary policy decisions also involve loss of life. For example, decisions about environmental regulation, transportation safety. Modern government could hardly begin to act were it the case that the condition of its legitimacy is to protect every life put at risk by its policies. We're not necessarily careless when we accept those risks. For the most part, we justify the choice to bear these risks by calculating that they reduce costs in the long run. Lives will be better, or more life years will be saved when we adopt a practice or technology. A technology or practice that imposes disproportionate costs is one that should be reformed. There's no justification for imposing costs disproportionate to benefits. To do so would be careless in the double sense of the word. That some individuals may suffer from reasonable choice is unfortunate, but not necessarily an indication of political carelessness. We are confronting this sort of decision right now in assessing the risks of different forms of the vaccine. There were many such moments of government rationality over the last year, but the most admirable moments of response were those that explicitly resisted the turn to calculation of costs and benefits. Entire societies locked themselves down for the sake of those least able to protect themselves. We acted together for the sake of the most vulnerable among us, the old, the sick, and those who take care of us. This was an affirmation of care. It expressed an idea of what we owe to every person, regardless of the cost. We do not save every life in a war. We do not save every life on the highways. Yet death in a war is not the same as death in a traffic accident, even if the government is responsible in some way for both. The pandemic asked of us and our leaders whether we would see the death from COVID as analogous to a death on the highway or a death in battle. Is it a cost or is it a sacrifice? The distinction between an unfortunate fatality and a sacrifice is not carried by facts and circumstance alone. No set of observations will answer the question for us. The distinction rather depends upon what we collectively make of our situation. We invest death with a meaning or we do not. The sacrifice is an ultimate expression of care. More precisely, it's a response to the recognition of the ultimate value of the other. The circumstances of sacrifice tell us a good deal about the nature of a political regime, just as they tell us about ourselves. We've seen a transformation right before our eyes as healthcare workers and essential workers became frontline troops in the war on COVID. Their deaths registered as sacrifices in a way that had not been true before the crisis. Those for whom they sacrificed take on the value created by those deaths. They did this for us. We are accordingly in their debt. This is the economy of care at stake in sacrifice. President Lincoln gave voice to this idea in the middle of the Civil War. These are some of the most famous lines in American political rhetoric. This is now Lincoln. It is for us, the living, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. Sacrifice puts a redemptive demand upon survivors. We assume an obligation to be the people for whom they sacrificed. Thus, the Christian martyrs created the possibility of a practice of ultimate meaning for generations of Christians. Similarly, it has become our political responsibility to recognize the dimensions of the sacred that are developing in and around today's public health crisis. When we stayed home, we were not calculating costs and benefits. We were affirming our care for each other. We were a sort of stay-at-home army, conscripted into a national campaign of care. We were standing with the healthcare workers who sacrificed for us. We were doing our part. When nations stopped to clap and cheer for those workers, they were expressing that care upon which legitimate politics depends. These investments of public meaning are limits on democratic majorities. Politics is about reason, but it is also about our mutual and reciprocal capacity to create and sustain a transcendent meaning, a meaning that links us to those who came before and those who will come later. A democratic government must pursue reasonable policies, but it must also support and sustain the faith that grounds the state as a source of ultimate meaning. This is care beyond justice. Absent that care, even a democratic majority can be illegitimate. The struggle for the soul of American democracy right now is not about how to deal with COVID, but whether we will be a people who care for each other or a careless people who ask of politics only, what's in it for me? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that thought-provoking lecture and the accompanying essay. I think there are lots of similarities to the local context and some nuanced differences that I hope we get to touch on during the discussion. Now, our next speaker, Deval, Dr. Desai, is a lecturer in international economic law at the Edinburgh Law School. He's previously taught at many prestigious institutions, including the Geneva Graduate Institute, the Harvard Institute for Global Law and Policy, and is a visiting professor at the Northeastern Law School, as well as in the School of Oriental and African Studies and the University of Los Andes. And this is a very abridged biography, professional biography of his. He serves on multiple editorial boards, mostly in law journals. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and some of his ongoing projects include the following. He's working on a project titled Reversing the Gaze Towards Post-Comparative Area Studies. He's also working on, I think, which will be the subject of his lecture today, The Puzzle of Unspent Funds, the Institutional Architecture of Unaccountable Governance. And his book, forthcoming book by Cambridge University Press, which we're very excited about, and I hope he will accept again when we knock at his door to come and discuss it with us. It's called Expect Ignorance, the Law and Politics of Rule of Law Reform. Deval holds degrees from Oxford, his master's degree, and his Juris Doctor from Harvard. Deval, over to you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, which certainly makes me sound better than I'm going to fulfill in the next 20 minutes. I'm deeply grateful to Bhaso for the opportunity to speak here, and to Paul and Miguel for the invitation to join what is a really fascinating volume. And I should say I had the absolute privilege of writing this piece with my colleagues, Shalini Randeria, who's the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, and Christine Lutringer, who's the executive director of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. So if there's anything you find interesting in the piece, it is to their credit. And if there's any fault that you find, it's mine and mine alone. So I'm going to be quite brief today. I'm most interested in the sort of reflections and conversation that we'll have after the remarks. But let me just frame the piece a little bit and then sketch out some of the arguments. So the piece, as Bhaso mentioned, is part of a project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, which focuses on this phenomenon of unspent funds in Italy and India, which I'll come to. And it was written at a very particular time, and it was sort of particular in three ways, more than three ways, but let's stick with three for now. So it was written in the midst of being all locked down, sort of physically restrained in one very particular space, trying to make sense of this strange new phenomenon that we were experiencing globally from within our own small chamber. And then written in that 3-week time horizon. So it was sort of within this strange, slightly pressure cooker moment. And in the midst of a crisis at the time that really seemed to be articulated as a global and shared one. So in Paul's terms, sort of a crisis at the time where the possibility of mutual care seemed to be on the political horizon of everyday life. And so the third thing that was particular about that moment was that myself and my co-authors kind of wanted to think about the politics which that view of crisis might make a little bit invisible or a little bit hard to see. So not a particularly insightful move, but really to think about the particular vulnerable groups whose vulnerability may have been invisible prior to the lockdown and similarly fell out of the register of care that Paul set out. So the example that many return to is the millions of migrant workers forced out of work during the initial lockdown in India and forced into risky travel to a home with no resources to support them or their families. So clearly right now we're in quite a different moment. So the current situation in India is dire at a broad and sort of social level as the health system verges on collapse. And so it's increasingly hard to find viable ways to justifiably juxtapose India and Italy. And the current politics of the crisis feel much more fragmented and variegated along national lines, vaccine lines, levels of vaccination, class lines, supply chain lines in terms of who has access to the material resources for things like vaccinations, north and south, although it is probably right to ask if this wasn't also the case a year ago. But it certainly feels from where I sit that it's a little bit different. And so the reason for setting that out is to say that I'm going to focus my remarks today a little bit bearing that current moment in mind, rather than sort of offer a general overview of the chapter. And so I'm going to do three things. And the first thing is to set out the particular empirical phenomenon that is the focus of the paper. And that are these unspent social welfare funds and their reappropriation during COVID-19. And my co-authors and I use this as a lens on the politics of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, because of the current circumstances, even though the chapter touches on India and Italy, I'm going to spend most of my time on India. Given the current situation there, these funds are increasingly relevant as emergency funds to respond to the increasingly dire crisis. But just as a caveat, the situation there is changing day by day. So I'm not making any claims to the enduring validity of anything that I'll have to say about these funds in respect to the current moment. The second thing that I'll do very briefly is just touch on 3 reminders about the politics of crisis that my co-authors and I suggest this phenomenon of unspent funds gives us, and then conclude with a quick note on the broader political stakes that those reminders offer. So taking the piece as a whole, or taking the intervention as a whole, we might say that the emphasis of our piece is on the institutional and administrative machinery of the state and the ways in which it shapes society and its political conditions through and as revealed by the crisis. So it's a slight shift in register from, but useful juxtaposition with Paul's intervention. So to the first part of the remarks, which is on the empirical phenomenon that we touch on in the piece. So these unspent special purpose social welfare funds. Let me give you an example from a fund that I've been looking at and thinking about for a couple of years now. So this fund is called the District Mineral Foundation. And the District Mineral Foundation was mandated by a 2015 Act of Parliament in India. And this act was sort of an omnibus modernization act for the extractives sector. And it included provisions requiring that money be collected through special purpose or hypothecated taxation for the benefit of mining affected communities. Now, this money was collected through the state's taxation power from mining companies and amounted to about 10% of the royalties that mining companies pay to the government. Now, the monies are then collected and supposedly deposited in what are called district level foundations. These foundations are sort of sui generis special purpose legal vehicles whose form varies from district to district, but which can be constituted as trusts. And the money is meant to be placed in those trusts to be spent for any benefit, short or long term, of the mining affected community. Now, to date, since 2015, $5 billion has been collected. Actually, as of this year, significantly more than that. Prior to the pandemic, 1.7 billion had been spent. So 3.3 billion was just lying in these funds. So this example provides an overview of some of the key features of these funds. I'll just spell them out in brief. First, that the funds are collected through direct or indirect taxation power of the state. Second, that the funds are for the specific purpose of tackling some sort of social vulnerability, a clearly articulated social vulnerability. Third, that the funds roll over and can't be reabsorbed into budgets, so they accumulate over time, unless they're spent. And fourth, that the funds are held apart from budgets in special purpose institutional vehicles that tend to be complex institutional arrangements that link private organization with administrative purpose and oversight. So these might be foundations, boards, trusts, corporations, and so on. Now, these vehicles exist for the specific purpose of holding the funds and spending them to tackle that specific vulnerability. And spending decisions tend to be taken by some constellation of public and private actors. Administrative agents of the state, trade unions in the case of some, external experts, the representatives of local sort of village level governance bodies, and so on. So it turns out that the accumulation of these funds is in no way unusual in India. First, the special purpose taxation for a range of articulated social vulnerabilities in India, from the welfare of laborers in different sectors, to those affected by environmental and social harms from natural resource extraction, to those affected by natural disasters, to victims of sexual abuse. Now, these funds are raised through a range of different taxation powers. This could be legislative appropriation, but also judicial decision. So the Supreme Court has determined that certain funds should be collected to remedy a particular vulnerability and mandated the constitution of some of these funds by passing legislative appropriation, even executive taking. Second, this sort of special purpose taxation is about 10% of all federal taxation. So it's quite a large amount. But it is difficult to get a clear picture of how much money is collected but not spent for a whole range of reasons. Incomplete accounting, the diversity of the taxation powers under which it's collected, as I mentioned, to the range of scales from municipal to state to central government, scales at which the money is collected. But just to give one example for a sense of the size of the phenomenon we're talking about, in financial year 2019 alone, $36.5 billion was collected in special purpose taxation, and only 22 billion of that was transferred to the relevant fund, the trust, the charitable body, and so on. So $14.5 billion just sort of sat in central government coffers, unusable because it sat there earmarked for the relevant fund, the relevant vulnerability. So it was unusable and gathering no interest at all. So the money was just dead, a pool of dead capital. And more broadly, anecdotal evidence that we've been looking at suggests that tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars are lying unspent on aggregate. Now, in the chapter, we do also discuss Italy. And just to give you a brief sense of how and why we're talking about Italy, for Italy, we focus on the spending of social funds which are allocated to Italy by the European Union. And these funds are meant to help those who have lost out through market integration. For example, because jobs have moved away from the region in which they live. Now, these funds are supposed to build people's human capital, for example, through job training schemes. Now, Italy too significantly underspends these funds. Around 37 billion euros remained unspent in 2020. Now, these funds differ from the Indian case in many respects, in particular that they're not collected through an individual state's taxation power, but rather through contributions from EU member states. And the funds do in fact expire after 7 years rather than rolling over in perpetuity. And as a result, we see in Italy a rush to get these funds out of the door as the seventh year approaches. So we have this phenomenon of unspent funds. Why do these funds remain unspent? Well, the reasons given for underspending in the literature are predominantly technical. In particular, the poor design of rules, the weak fiscal capacity of the state to absorb and channel money, and the weak bureaucratic capacity of the state to come up with viable ways to spend that money. To the extent that there are political explanations, they have to do with the politics of expenditure. For example, some bureaucrats in India appear to be afraid of accusations of corruption if they authorize expenditure. Others might be waiting for an opportune political moment to expend. Now, this sort of opportune political moment brings us to COVID-19. In both India and Italy, we saw unspent funds being reappropriated in the name of COVID relief. So in India, the unspent balance of a particular fund to benefit migrant construction workers, which was about $4.25 billion US, was mobilized to provide emergency support for the poor and marginalized at the onset of India's first lockdown last year. And this was done through political and administrative pressure from the central state to the local special purpose vehicles, the local boards, whose job it was to steward and manage the funds. To take another example, 30% of that unspent $3.3 billion balance in district mineral foundations was also made available for healthcare spending more broadly, this time through the state's emergency powers under that 2015 legislation. Interestingly, we found that this has led to only a marginal uptick in spending rates from the district mineral foundations. So whereas before the pandemic, there was about a 1.5% expenditure rate of unspent balances, that's moved up to about 2.2% expenditure rate of unspent balances. We also saw other creative forms of reappropriation in India. In Odisha state, $1.7 billion was held in a different special purpose fund to benefit mining affected communities, this time a fund mandated directly by the Supreme Court. Now, the Odisha state government, so the sort of regional entity, gave itself the authority to borrow that entire unspent corpus at about 1.5% below market interest rates as a means of plugging budget gaps brought on by COVID. Now, I'll note that similar to India and Italy, there's also been a change in patterns of expenditure for European social funds in response to COVID. The money is no longer only to be spent on tackling vulnerabilities caused by market integration, it can be spent on healthcare and not just human capital. And it can also be spent on different regions and not just those that have lost the most out of market integration. So it can even be spent on healthcare expenditure in wealthy regions of Italy. So a point that we make in looking at these modes of reappropriation is that in both India and Italy, the reappropriation of these funds was not done by tackling those causes of underspending. Rather, the relevant governments suspended or worked around those causes in ways that enabled the reappropriation of those funds. They borrowed the funds, they used emergency powers, they placed selective political pressure on local administrators to expend. And this, we argue in the chapter, reveals a few things about the politics of underspending, and perhaps a little bit about the politics of state-society relations during COVID. So the first point that we might make is that the funds and their reappropriation remind us that social vulnerabilities are an important dimension of the politics of crisis, especially in the context of a health crisis such as COVID-19. The unspent funds remind us to pay attention not only to struggles over civil and political life, but also, and insuperably, struggles over the categorization of certain social groups, the economic and social rights and entitlements they're promised, and their transformations in times of crisis. So, for example, the Indian state continues to recognize the specific vulnerabilities of construction workers and mining affected communities for the purposes of collecting revenue in their names. But through this ongoing process of failing to spend on promised entitlements to remedy those vulnerabilities, and then reappropriating that money in the name of COVID relief, the state has subsumed those vulnerabilities into the general good through its fiscal activities. And so we ask, what are the political processes and consequences of these sorts of transformations for state-society relations? Second, the funds remind us of the importance of paying attention to the mundane administrative machinery of the state, its rules, its processes, as sites where the politics of crisis play out, on top of attention paid to constitutional and high politics. This sort of complex of underspending and reappropriation that I just discussed can only exist in the context of a specific institutional constellation. In particular, it requires that the funds be hard to trace, and thus the difficulties I mentioned earlier in terms of public audits, and spending hard to compel, which relates in our cases to the institutional fragmentation, the multiplicity of public and private actors and institutional forms, and the wide range of eligible expenditures that I discussed. In sum, this sort of dynamic or complex of underspending and reappropriation rests on a particular form of weak accountability for underspending. And we might want to inquire into the institutional conditions and forms that enable underspending and reappropriation, and in particular, the ways in which they shape the ability of citizens to hold the administrative state accountable. Third, this example might remind us a little bit of the continuities between ordinary and emergency times. So the emergency reappropriation of funds was enabled by this arrangement of vulnerability and accountability prior to the crisis. And the crisis seemed to continue this arrangement. For example, DMF funds still remain underspent, even in the face of public awareness, high levels of discretion, and a massive and fatal COVID wave in India. What or who are the relevant decision makers waiting for? And how does this shape the political relationships between decision makers, the public, and particular identified vulnerable groups? So that being said, so what? What are the bigger stakes of this otherwise somewhat esoteric and potentially quite technical topic? Let me just set out 3 points in brief before I conclude. So first, in India and Italy and beyond, the state is back in a big way. And this is the state in its administrative guise, spending on healthcare, welfare, infrastructure, and so on. Second, as an anecdotal observation, whether it's a tool of political legitimation to allay some fears about the sort of sprawling administrative state, or a management tool to organize such big spending, special purpose funds really do seem to be an important part of this expansion of the state. This is certainly the case globally, in the EU, in India, and elsewhere. And it seems really important to think of these phenomena as political phenomena, these special purpose funds as political phenomena, about the interplay of vulnerability, society, and the state, and not just matters for technical design. In particular, we might want to pay close attention to their proclaimed special purpose, the proclaimed vulnerability that they're designed to tackle, and their accountability mechanisms. And third, finally, that this sort of close attention may well matter. For example, in India, we've seen the Prime Minister institute a charitable trust for emergency relief run directly from his office. It's able to receive philanthropic donations and is structured so that it doesn't appear to be subject to public audit. So how, might we ask, might such an increase in special purpose funds, and particularly those sorts of special purpose funds, their politics and their design, shape state-society relations through and beyond the crisis?
Thank you very much, Deval, for this inspiring and very thorough scholarship, which I think intersects law, politics, and economics. Simply amazing work by yourself and your colleagues. So I'm just going to very briefly share my takes on the book. As I said, I promise I will not be very long. Just some of the key takeaways, also from a South African context. So the first thing I take away from the book, and I think this would be true universally, in addition to the countries that are closely examined in the book and in the two lectures from today, there's a sense in which the government is both doing too much and not enough, depending on who's looking or who's asking and who's answering. I think this perhaps, reintroduces the concept of two concepts of liberty, as Isaiah Berlin called it, in the sense of freedom to versus freedom from. And for some, the government is simply overreaching, but for others who expect a bit more from governments are underreaching. This is something that I also pick up in the chapter by Chappell and Posen, which I think is chapter 2 in the volume. The other key thing which I take away from the book is that the pandemic will be politically defined rather than purely biologically defined, in the sense that even to imagine a post-pandemic world brings to mind a political sort of solution rather than purely biological terms, and whether what the post-pandemic future will look like is itself a political imagination, is a politically imagined future. There is, in other words, no scale independent of politics by which to measure the success or failures of our respective governments. And I think one other thing that the book emphasizes is that differences in outcomes, at least during the pandemic phase, the pre-vaccine phase, were not purely determined by economics, stages of economic development. In other words, even countries with a certain, whom you'd expect to have a certain kind of response, given the amount of resources that they have, did not respond as effectively as you might have imagined. Although with the rollout of the vaccine, certainly economics has made a sort of unceremonious return, has given us a sort of rude awakening once again, that inequality is very much important. Although, again, as Paul spoke to, even the rollout of the pandemic itself is political, different political inclinations. You can almost predict which party somebody belongs to by their sort of perception of the pandemic, by their trust or lack thereof of the vaccine. Excuse me. So this is, I think, a reintroduction of economics into the scene, although still very much politically mediated. And I think something common to both of these chapters and both of these lectures is the sense that we, the people, because democracy is about we, the people, is not to be taken for granted. What we mean by we, the people, in a democratic dispensation or in a democratic order, democracies always inevitably exclude or oppress some populations, and that is the political economy that of state-society relations that Deval and his colleagues very much sharpened in the analysis. On the other hand, we are more than our governments. We are citizens. So we, the people, once again, takes on an important function when we talk about the politics of sacrifice in citizen to community sort of relations, and how we, as Paul puts it, we are being asked to consider what we owe to each other because individual choice has been so important and has been so central in how we behave in terms of the pandemic. Is it a demos worth of sacrifice? Who is the demos that is worthy of sacrifice, and who isn't? And I think this is very important. This is a truism almost when you talk about democracy, because even if you look at the ancient Greek foundations of democracy, Athens was a slave society where not everyone had the right to vote. Not everyone had political participation. There was slavery. Women were excluded. Foreigners were excluded. And one other thing which I thought was quite interesting was in the local context, when you talk about how the government relates to the community, how to the society at large, there is again a sense of exclusion. When you think, for example, when the lockdown began in March of last year, there were troops deployed, quite literally. The book focuses quite a lot on the sort of metaphor of frontline health workers being the troops. But at least in South Africa, the troops were very much the troops, military men in military uniform and women in military uniform, quote unquote, to help vulnerable communities comply with COVID regulations. But that, of course, is code word. That is, when we talk about vulnerable communities, that brings to mind a particular kind of community in the South African context. And I think this evinces an important niche for perhaps a layer of post-colonial theory which can be applied. Why is it so easy? Why is it so easy for a government in South Africa to deploy troops? Because this was very early on, and as Buthelezi puts it, this was not even approved by Parliament. The executive made the decision and informed Parliament, and Parliament merely blessed the decision post the fact of deployment. And this has led to a resurgence of literature around the states of exception theory. The states of exception phenomenon, of course, being that governments want to break laws in the name of the public good, that they suspend constitutions. And South Africa has a fantastic constitution, but the deployment of the military has brought back memories of the 90s, and even before then, when the country was quite different, was quite oppressive. This level of troop deployment is the largest since the 1990s, when we're almost in a sort of civil war like condition. So the other thing which I thought was quite interesting, especially in the context of Deval's and his colleagues' work around money, the public purse, how it's administered, and the setting up of a charitable sort of purse within the office of the executive. In India, there was the Prime Minister Cares, which is the Prime Minister's Citizen Assistance Relief in Essential Situations Fund, which is, as you said, is administered rather ambiguously, has a sort of grey legal status. In South Africa, we also have the Solidarity Fund, which was also set up very early on by the president, which I think many of us, if we were to be quizzed on the street, how does it work? What sort of oversight is in place? I'm not very sure many of us would have the correct answer to. The other important thing, and I'm almost through here, is the concept of the cunning state, as it is called, a state which, in a sense, is variously weak and variously strong, depending on whom it is dealing with and what's at question. And it acts and does things not because they are legal, but because the specific subgroups are vulnerable and powerless. So these are just some of my impressions based on the book and reading it within a South African and African context. So we will now head to the question and answer session of the discussion of this evening's proceedings. So I have so far one question on the chat box, and it's for Deval. So it says, does vulnerability provide the basis for one to demand assistance from the state? So does vulnerability provide the basis for one to demand assistance from the state? Follows up with, what does this mean for the individual responsibility? I think Paul could perhaps say a thing or two here. Does the nature of these vulnerabilities matter when governments decide on whether to spend money or not? So that is from Gift. So we'll start with Deval.
Thank you. So there is a sort of a technical answer to this, and then a slightly more conceptual set of reflections. So the technical answer is that there are very variegated and somewhat fluid ideas about vulnerability at play, whether it's the identification of very specific groups, whether it's the identification of very specific situations, whether it's the identification of very specific statuses. These are all deployed in order to procure or legitimate certain forms of taxation that will then be put towards the remedying of those vulnerabilities. So there are many different types of vulnerability available in legislation, and those have changed interestingly over time. So there was a heavy emphasis on labor vulnerabilities in the 80s and 90s. As the Indian economy liberalized, those vulnerabilities had more to do with specific types of economic harm on particular communities, for example, mining affected communities, and sort of particular geolocated harms as well. So it used to be that there were several funds instituted at once for various different types of worker, and then those have sort of transformed over time. So the types of vulnerability reflect, in a lot of ways, transformations in the Indian political economy. But I'm not sure if there was a slightly more sort of conceptual question there, which is perhaps slightly more of an emphasis on demand, that it is the institutional setup here when we're talking about these special purpose funds. Are they rightly understood as being a bargain between the vulnerable group and the state that is organized around the politics of demand? The vulnerable group is demanding some sort of benefit from the state. Because if there is no such demand within the political bargain, then it weakens the logic of the argument that I set out, whereby the state is collecting money on the presumed demand by vulnerable groups for protection or solidarity, and then not delivering on it. And that, I think, is another way of formulating the political question around the effects of the public fisc, and in particular, the politics of revenue collection and expenditure around welfare in general, and in particular around welfarism focused on notions of vulnerability, which is, do we understand the basic constitutive bargain of those administrative activities underpinned by a view of the state as a revenue collection and dispensing machine as being focused on a politics of demand versus, for example, a politics of care, as Paul might put it, or a politics of pity, a politics of moralism, and there have been various articulations of that sort of welfare throughout, historically and in different sort of geographic spaces. This is a deeply contested question in India. So you might range from scholars who focus on the politics of vulnerability as an articulation of communal care, of which there are many in different registers. We use Veena Das in the piece, through to the strongly political economic bents of someone like Kalyan Sanyal, who would argue that vulnerability does not provide a basis for a demand for assistance from the state, but rather the state has a strong interest in providing welfare in order to sustain that basic form of vulnerability. I don't have, or I wouldn't presume to provide a clear position on it, other than to say, I think that is an articulation of the politics of the organization of these welfare funds and how they get defined, redefined, and contested, that I think the COVID crisis has brought to light. As the funds have been reappropriated, their reappropriation has invoked different types of vulnerability, but also different bases on which the vulnerable might be entitled to some sort of attention from the state.
Thank you very much, Deval. Paul, any take on the notion of vulnerability and entitlement?
Well, sure. I'll say just a few words. So I'm from the United States, and we are notoriously bad at recognizing a link between a claim of legal right and a claim of vulnerability. It's kind of built into the political culture. So as a legal matter, no, a vulnerability in and of itself, the need for what we would call welfare. We're a country without a universal health care plan. That makes us unique. And of course, huge amounts of attention have been brought to this under the name of structural racism. And I think you cannot understand American resistance to these ideas without understanding racism on the one hand, but the frontier and the nature of American history on the other. So these two things are not naturally linked. We have no right to health care. We have no right to housing. We have no rights of these sorts in our Constitution. But I do think that the pandemic is, again, a vast experiment about reconsideration of the relationship between responsibility and vulnerability. So there's been pressure with respect to COVID to make it universally available, testing universally available, vaccines universally available. That's new, and of course there are mixed arguments about that. And some say, well, it's in the self-interest of the well-off to make sure that everybody's vaccinated, and of course that's true. But it's not an either-or situation. You can recognize that and recognize a moral political obligation to the vulnerable. It's not an accident, as I said in my talk, that the Black Lives Matter movement explodes in the middle of this. That's a cry and a recognition that we need a new politics organized around structural vulnerabilities. And it's deeply, deeply affecting institutions. My own institution, I think, is typical. Yale Law School has in many ways reoriented itself around this claim. I personally think that's rather amazing, since if you had asked me what the dominant message, pedagogic message, scholarly message of the Yale Law School had been for the last 40 years, in time period with which I've known it, it's been emphasizing structural racism. It's as if the rest of the nation caught up to what we've been teaching for a long time. Nevertheless, the political situation is such that we have felt pressure to acknowledge and talk about it expressly and rethink our own policies. And I think that's going on everywhere in the country. But it's not, it's not a single picture, because we would be misrepresenting the state of the country if you didn't recognize that there's a vast amount of resistance organized on the right through social media, through networks, through the Republican political party that takes a different view. And the pandemic is a site of political confrontation over this, and we don't know what's going to happen or how it's going to come out.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul. So we're getting quite a number of questions. This one is for Paul. There's been a lot of talk about a new social contract being needed. One of your important points in your lecture has been to emphasize that the social contract is between both states and us, but also between ourselves as citizens. And one of the main points in your lecture is about the concept of collective authorship. And the question is collective authorship still possible in the context of the US and other democracies which have seen populism, or if citizens become too divided? And there's a second sub-question to this: might the response to the pandemic in the US have played out differently had 2020 not been an election year?
Well, let me talk to the first point first. So I have another book coming out in the not too distant future. It's called Democracy in America. And its first chapter, it makes the claim, which I was quite explicit about before the election and pondering post the election, about two things. One, the United States is in a civil war. That is a kind of cold war, but not completely cold. We have violent outbreaks, but the depth of the division between the political groups in the United States is as deep as it is in conditions of civil war. And there are two measures of that, all right? One is we're beyond the capacity of our political institutions to resolve our differences. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the election of Biden. A very large minority of the country, somewhere between 30 and 40%, most of the Republican Party does not accept the election, right? And the same thing would be true of Supreme Court decisions. A very large percentage of the country doesn't accept its decisions. So our institutions are no longer capable of resolving our differences. To me, that's a definition of a condition of war. Whether it becomes violent or not, we are in a kind of pre-political state again, in which the institutions can't keep the peace, you might say, can't work the settlement. And I think the second way I would put that is, what does that institutional difference express? It expresses a lack of care. We are two communities that fundamentally don't care about each other. And you see this, you know, in its rough form in the vicious character of political speech in the country. And it's just, intolerably violent and disrespectful. So the second thing I was arguing before the election was, under conditions of civil war, we have to seriously consider secession. Maybe we're not capable of being one country anymore. And what does secession look like? And here are people will just kind of laugh at me and say, what are you talking about? And I say, well, secession isn't going to look like the American Civil War of the 19th century. That's not what secession is going to look like. Secession is going to look kind of like kind of like a more indistinct phenomena. We're going to see regional governance emerging. We're going to see, we're going to have open borders, so to speak, but we're going to see less and less coming from the center, from Washington, and more state-centered, regional-centered keeping of the tax money in those areas, doing for oneself less support. And so new political arrangements will evolve. Think of, Quebec in Canada. And so that's the direction in which we are going to move, and maybe we should move. We should move if we can't resolve our differences. Then the question is, well, did the election in November show anything different? Are we in a different, was I exaggerating? Was it too much? And here I would say, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic, particularly as the idea that Biden's an illegitimate, unelected president persists, particularly as Trump continues to dominate the Republican Party. So you know, I'm pessimistic about American politics. Not quite as pessimistic as I was before the election. I think Biden was was a good choice for the country because he's reassuring. He expresses care for the entire country. Whether it will be reciprocated, we don't know. But we are in terms of the continuation of the political community that has existed for 200 and some odd years. We're in a very dangerous moment, and that's why the whole point of my talk is about care as the constitutive virtue of a political community. If we don't care, we shouldn't be too political. We shouldn't be a political community. There are other arrangements that can achieve our legal and political ends, and maybe we would be better off with them. I don't remember the second question, but probably we're getting late here.
I think you touched on it quite a bit, because the question was, might the response to the pandemic have played out differently had 2020 not been an election year in the US?
For sure. But conversely, if 2020 had not been a year of pandemic, Trump would still be the president, and that should scare you as well.
Thank you very much. This next question from Professor Sarah Chiumbu, I suppose it's for both our speakers. Are there ways that a pandemic such as COVID-19 can be managed without breaking some democratic rules and principles? Is there an alternative way? And I think the broader question perhaps is, how have democracies done? How have they been able to sustain themselves? Have they remained democratic societies? And is there a need perhaps for an alternative way? So let's start with Deval.
Thank you. So I'm going to actually pick up on that and link it a little bit to a reflection on Paul's last intervention. I think they might come together a little bit. In response to Sarah, the presumption there is that there is more change and less continuity. So one of the arguments that one might very plausibly make about India is that what might be seen as a breaking of democratic rules and principles, in our case, the reappropriation of these funds through executive fiat and weak accountability, is a continuity with a set of, a type of politics that persisted prior to the pandemic. The reason I think, or I wonder if this might relate to Paul's prior intervention, is to reflect a little bit on the invocation of institutional non-resolution. That the institutions just can't settle disputes anymore. And one of the interesting things about the cases that we're looking at in India that has been a staple of post-colonial legal theorists in particular, not limited to the post-colony, is the idea of the institutionalized institutional non-resolution as being descriptive of a mode of governance. The continual non-resolution and deferral of contentious politics as the vehicle for contentious politics. So to translate that a little bit into questions of care, one way in which one might interpret the unspent funds that we're talking about in India are a particular dissection of care. That there's perhaps the performance, the production, the institutionalization, performance in the performative sense of a particular type of care in the invocation of certain groups for the purposes of tax collection, revenue collection. But on all accounts, by the state, but also interestingly by social movements, not that much care about whether or not the money is being spent and how it's being spent on the specific particularities of the lives of the vulnerable groups in question and the amelioration of their position. So there's care in one very particular way to get the ball moving, to get the money in, and then a stepping back from care in terms of getting the money out. Bhaso, you'd mentioned, one of the themes being, if I read it right, essentially, one of the things you took from our piece is essentially being sort of a form of governance through ambiguity. We might say cultured ambiguity. This kind of perpetual non-resolution, this playing of strong and weak. And Yeah, I guess I would just reflect that in response to Sarah's question, and to link it to Paul's intervention, that perhaps that sort of ambiguity works well in crisis moments as much as non-crisis moments, or to put it another way, doesn't feel the distinction between the exceptional and the everyday quite as forcefully.
So can I say a word on this?
Absolutely, please go ahead.
So one of the themes in some of the chapters of the books, and one of the great political themes of our moment, is the conditions for and the development of, let's call it, legal authoritarianism. And so what we're discovering is that there is not as tight a relationship between legal structure and democratic politics as we might have thought. And I think this was reflected in my talk in the first section, in which I basically was trying to say, look, we can't expect much from the courts in helping us through this situation, because the courts themselves have become sites of political contestation. Turns out law is a lot less of a limit than we thought. The same legal system can produce Trump and can produce Biden. And whether you get one or the other is a completely contingent matter. And they have huge differences for the legal order and the political order and the moral order of the country. So we have an essay in the book by Roberto Gargarella, who talks about Latin America and how there has been a movement towards authoritarianism again that we should be worried about, but within the law, and how law is being used in some way to undermine democratic values. And of course, that's the story in Eastern Europe with Hungary and Poland as well. So it's less and less useful a question to ask whether we can deal with the pandemic within the law, because the law we see is a much more indeterminate than we thought. And we're having this huge argument in the United States right now about what can be done by executive action, what can be done by the president alone, given the gridlock in Congress. You can't get legislation through. Well, this started under Obama. You know, we can't get legislation through. Well, there are political necessities. There are things that have to happen. And so do we reinterpret the power of the executive to allow them to go forward? And that ultimately becomes a question for the courts. And then we see courts that are themselves not respected as politically independent. So it becomes a self-reinforcing question of politics. And we're never quite sure what the limits are in these interpretations and reinterpretations of constitutional structure, because there's a mix of doctrine, partisan politics, and let's call it political necessity. You can't quite predict how any particular issue is going to come out, which makes us very uncertain what kind of legal order we live in. In the United States, literally, for many of the people, let's call them the people of the blue states, the last 4 years was a matter of shock. We didn't know. We didn't know that our country, our legal order was so vulnerable, so plastic, so indeterminate, that we could have move from what we thought was, you know, the oldest liberal democracy in the world to an authoritarian, populist, white nationalist regime on the basis of what? You know, 80,000 votes in a country of 350 million people. Shocking. And of course, this isn't over. We don't know what the future is going to look like.
Thank you. So we are almost at time, and I hope I can borrow maybe 5 minutes extra from the both of you to take 2 more questions. So this one is also from Gift. The preface is there a universal conception of care? Doesn't it imply an immutable definition of the social good? And how do we judge governments on the notion of care? Is it by output or by intent? So this is, I suppose, directed for Paul.
So that's a really good question and a really hard question. And you'll get different answers from theologians and politicians, I think. So is there a universal idea of care? The answer would have to be yes. It's called Christianity. So the universal idea of care transcends politics. and becomes a religion. And we can talk about that. In my book on sacred violence, I talk a lot about politics being marked by reciprocal violence and religion not being marked in that way. A religion, a sacrificial religion, accepts violence without doing violence in response. So yes, is there a difference between what I call the moral saint, the person you don't want for a parent, and the universalism of care? That's a hard question too, and I tend to think maybe not. But you know, I don't know what it'd be like to have you know, Albert Schweitzer as your father either. Probably not great, would be my guess. So I do think you're touching on a very hard distinction between politics and religion. And one of the theses that I've been developing over the last few years is that the nation state really is a successor religion in the Western theological tradition and shouldn't be understood as secular at all. So I do think universal care, yes, universal care is a political phenomena, probably not. It's like asking whether there can be a universal family. You miss something without the borders, without the a division. And of course, political efforts to universalize the family have a long tradition of totalitarianism, reaching back to Plato's Republic. So this is not an idea that we're particularly enthusiastic about. Maybe I should end it there because we're so running out of time.
Thank you, Paul. A last question going out to both our speakers. One of the liveliest debates fundamentally in democratic theory, both from a constitutional legal perspective as well as from political science, is federalism versus unitary form of governance. So both India and the US are federal systems. How has this feature of their governance shaped the response to the pandemic, both for good and for bad, and ultimately which has outweighed the other? So again, we're going to start with Deval and then go to Paul.
So that's a very difficult question, both as a matter of an analysis of the institutional structure of India, but also as it's a very live and ongoing enactment. It's constantly being debated in the midst of this crisis, particularly at the current moment. So perhaps the safest thing to say would be that the federal structure has proven to be a central part of the arsenal, of the tactical repertoire of administrative authorities to avoid accountability for doing nothing. So there's been a very, very clear move by state authorities to point to the center and vice versa. So it's a really core part of the institutional architecture of this sort of unaccountable accumulation of pools of liquidity on the back of the vulnerable. That's probably the safest brief answer that I can give.
I would say it's completely ambiguous. From a public health perspective, you can see, if you look at the United States, federalism was a virtue under the Trump administration, which undermined the public health capacities and institutions of the federal government. So you could have states taking the lead in the absence of federal intervention, and that's a virtue. Of course, they could not do it as well as the federal government could have done it, so it was a mess. But it was something. It was better than, you know, injecting bleach into your veins. It was something, but they didn't have the capacity to coordinate at a national and international scale, so they ended up competing for PPE, and they couldn't, of course, develop their own vaccine. So it was a mess, but it was something. So it has a kind of safety of a function. Once the federal government decides to get involved, and its vast resources and access to money are devoted to the public health mission, federalism becomes, you know, from a public health point of view, it becomes more problematic. we want universal standards. We want everybody to be vaccinated. We want the same standards across state lines. It becomes very difficult when you can cross a state line and get out of one public health regime and into another. So at that point, it's from a public health perspective, not helpful at all, I think. Of course, you could, because there are such disagreements within the country. And so you allow states to have their own policies. It allows the kind of the absorption and the possibility for diverse politics not to confront each other so directly. And remember, every pandemic, as I said at the beginning, is a biological and a political problem. So federalism may be helpful even when it's not useful as a public health tool on the political side. It's very hard to assess. At the moment, it's national healthcare policy that's driving the rapid and fairly successful vaccination effort in this country. It never could have happened without the federal government. So you needed that commitment. On the other hand, allowing some state differences provides an outlet for violently political differences.
Thank you very much, Paul. So we are at the end of our proceedings, having gone over by a couple of minutes. Please excuse this running over the time, but I think it's an indicator of how great the discussion was. So we would like to very much thank our two speakers for taking the time to join us and to share their ideas and to share their findings with us. And we congratulate them and their colleagues on this quite important publication. It's called Democracy in Times of Pandemic. If you are in the university system, you should also be able to get an ebook from Cambridge Core. So be very much seek out the book. We also would like to thank JIAS, the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study for hosting us, Vanessa Kennedy and her colleagues for broadly marketing the event. And of course, we thank our audience for their presence and their participation. Thank you very much. A good day to Paul and a good evening to the rest of us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.